You're listening to The Social Workers on WCDB, University at Albany, FM station. I'm Kathryn Zox, your social worker with a microphone here. My guest is here this morning, and my guest is Robert Hess, Chairman and CEO of Housing Solutions USA, and he's here to talk to us about the future of homelessness, which is a huge problem here in the state of New York, and particularly in New York City. At last count, he says there are some 50,000 people in New York City shelters. Welcome to the show. Nice to have you on this morning, Robert.
Thanks so much for having me, Kathryn.
Great to have you. So, unfortunately, homelessness, and this is obviously an appropriate topic for the School of Social Welfare, so we're really interested in what you have to say about the future of homelessness. And I guess as you define it, there is a crisis of homelessness.
You know, Kathryn, sadly there is. I think we've seen all these economic downturns and the effect it's had on an awful lot of people. The people that have really been, I think, devastated the most severely are those that were poor to begin with and hanging on by a thread to begin with, and now find themselves experiencing homelessness across our state and certainly in the city of New York and across our country.
So, Robert Hess, tell us what about Housing Solutions USA. What is it? What do you do? As I understand it, your organization houses, 5,500 homeless people in 43 different New York City locations?
Well, sadly, that was necessary last night, and we were able to house that many individuals in shelters across the 5 boroughs of New York last night. I wish it wasn't necessary. We look for the day when it's not, but Housing Solutions USA, we're here to help the city of New York meet its legal and moral obligations to house every man, woman, and child every night. We work very hard to do that. We do that with dignity and respect for every person that walks through our doors. And we also try to reach out to the business community, the government and nonprofit communities to create partnerships that will help all of our homeless individuals be able to move from shelter as quickly as possible back into the community, into stable housing, and hopefully with jobs that will pay them enough to be able to allow them to pay their bills later on.
All right, let's get specific about this, because if you provide these services to all of the, that's a lot of people in one city, and we're talking about, as you describe it, high-quality housing services. But now you do temporary, people can use the facilities on a temporary or an emergency basis. Sometimes it's permanent. Can you describe specifically the kind of service that you provide for the homeless?
We provide temporary emergency shelter, and so families and individuals are with us, typically right now about a year, because it's difficult to be able to move out of shelter into stable housing in the community and be able to pay the rent for many individuals. So we tend to see the length of stay sadly increasing rather than decreasing at the moment. But folks can stay with us as long as they need to, working with our very competent social work staff to be able to move on as quickly as possible. We certainly don't want to see a child have one birthday in shelter, never mind 2. So we help folks move along as quickly as possible, but that's difficult in these current conditions.
Well, how do you get into the shelter? Let's say an example, because I think examples are always, good, put a face on it. So there's somebody or a family who needs housing or temporary housing, let's say in the beginning on an emergency basis. What's the process? What do they do?
Well, a family in New York City, under New York City's right to shelter, which, of course, New York City has the only right to shelter in our country. The family would go to the city intake center at Path in the Bronx, be assessed, and then assigned to a shelter around the city. And in the case of one of ours, they would be assigned to the shelter. They would arrive. They would go through an orientation, an intake briefing, and then be housed all on the same day.
And do people know about it? I mean, in terms of, I mean, there, as you describe it, I mean, this service obviously is available, but people who are in a position, and what is your typical client, let's say, who are to need shelter? How do they avail them? How do they know that that's out there? I mean, that they have to go to the Bronx or wherever. You know what I'm saying? Like they have to have some idea. Is this through a social worker or a social service agency, or how does that work?
Well, typically, I think it's through word of mouth, whether that be someone else that's had experience in the shelter system in New York City, or whether it's through one of the many community social service agencies that they might come in contact with. The other way that that folks could find out the way to get into shelter in the city is to call 311 in New York City, and they would be advised where to go and how to access shelter. And of course, for single individuals that may find themselves sadly on the streets, there are also outreach workers and police officers who will make referrals to intake centers so that we can get folks into shelter.
Because, Robert, sometimes, and I was just talking to Noah, one of the students here who's running the board, and I said, it's particularly in the summer, maybe not so much in the winter, but in the summertime in the city, and I'm often in the city, I see homeless people very often in the alcove of churches, for instance, and there are usually a significant amount of people there. Are they allowed to stay there, or do the policemen have an obligation to get them off the street and into the homeless shelter, or can they just stay there if they want to? And
if the church allows individuals to stay on the church steps, then that is a safe haven area, and the police would not be moving them off of those steps. However, we would be engaging them routinely with outreach workers, street outreach workers, to encourage folks to come in and get the services that they're entitled to, and have an opportunity to have a bed in a shelter, or a room in shelter, as opposed to living on the streets.
Why do people not want to go to a shelter? What are some of the reasons? Because I think you did a survey, as I understand it, actually asking homeless people what were the reasons for not wanting to be in a shelter, why they would want to be on the street.
You know, we did, and what we found was very interesting. What we found generally was that people that have lived on the street for a long period of time really are not living on the street because they want to live on the streets. They're living on the streets because they believe that living on the streets is the best option available to them today. And what I mean by that is their experience over time with the shelter system has been, at least in their case, that the shelter system was too large in some respects and really didn't make them feel comfortable, had too many rules, and there are a lot of rules within the shelter system, and those kinds of things just weren't working for them. And so we spent a fair amount of time talking to those long-term individuals staying on the streets and figuring out the kind of housing that would work for them.
Well, when you say too big, they're saying too big, the people who are on the streets, and they'll say that it doesn't work for them because what does too big mean? Like they're big facilities with lots of families living in the same space, or what does that mean?
Well, what it means to them varies a little bit. But what we were able to take from those conversations was that if we created relatively small facilities, 20 beds to 50 beds, and if we minimize the rules and minimize the bureaucracy and allowed people to come and go as they please, and looked at the longest-term street stayers and offered them those beds first, they would come in. And so we created in New York City, the city of New York created over 500 safe haven beds and targeted them or offered them to the people that have stayed on the streets the longest. And there were many skeptics that said these folks aren't coming inside. They never will. Well, the reality is that they did come in. They came in, and no bed was left vacant for more than 2 weeks once it was made available. Every bed was filled, and it was filled by people that, on average, had lived on the streets of New York City for over 8 years. And you know what? They didn't come and go, and they didn't abuse any rules generally. What happened was they tended to stay in. They tended to decrease their drug or alcohol use. They tended to become healthier over time, and they tended to want even better housing over time. So they wanted to go to the next level. And so it was, I think, by any measure, a huge success and a model of the kinds of things that we can do to help reduce homelessness in New York City and in New York State and across the country.
So you changed their expectations, as you said, brought it up a notch. Their expectation for what a proper housing was became this, not being out on the street. But there were some rules, because it wasn't just you can maybe, I guess you could come and go as you please, but no weapons, no fighting, and no drugs or alcohol.
That's right. Those were the three rules, Kathryn, and they were three rules that added to the safety of the facility and the comfort of the individuals coming and going. And they were well received because they were rules that people on the street told us that made sense to them. And so I think the real lesson here is we listened to the people that needed the help and crafted the solution that they said would work for them. And once they saw that solution was real, they responded well to it.
All right, so we have this model, as you're describing it sounds like anyway. So why aren't we just doing it all over the city and the state and we've solved the problem? Because I don't think we have.
Well, that this is one segment of people experiencing homelessness, people that are long-term street stayers. In New York City, that number has been significantly reduced. And so that's a real victory. Now, this is not a one-size-fits-all situation, and we need a variety of models for a variety of populations. For families with children, the situation is very different than single individuals that have lived on the streets for years. And so it calls for a different set of strategies, a different set of solutions. And I think the basic premise historically has been that cities and states and other jurisdictions create a homeless department or a homeless agency, and somehow there is the belief that agency is supposed to end homelessness in that jurisdiction. And what we've learned over time is that's just a false premise. I mean, really, in New York City, the primary agency is the Department of Homeless Services, and there are those that believe it can end homelessness by itself or create affordable housing or create the jobs that pay a living wage. And none of that, of course, is true. Really, what the Department of Homeless Services does and does very, very well is act as sort of the homeless emergency room. It's the place that, like an emergency room, people go when they're sick. Well, the emergency room didn't cause the illness, didn't cause the accident. It stabilizes the patient, moves them to the appropriate level of care. Department of Homeless Services does much the same thing in New York City. An individual or family becomes homeless. They go to the intake center. They get assigned the appropriate shelter for emergency services, and hopefully move on quickly to permanent housing. And so that they do well. I think the lesson that we have to learn in New York City and across the state of New York and across the country, indeed, is that it really takes an entire administration or entire government working together to eliminate the causes of homelessness if we really want to reduce homelessness over time.
Yeah, and I know that you just recently gave a speech at NYU, the School of Social Work, and one of the things I had access to your speech, and I think it was interesting because you are saying, because we're going to have a new mayor, that it really has to be part of the campaign issue that the new mayor has to address as a public policy issue, the issue of homelessness in New York City, which I agree with you. But can we be specific about what agencies? You're saying that it's not just this one department. As you say, they're like an emergency service, the Department of Homeless Services, but then you have to have all these other agencies involved. So who should, and what agencies and who should oversee it so that we can,
Yeah, well, it's a great question. I think that, what would make sense in New York City is for a new mayor to think seriously about creating what I'll call an interagency council on homelessness that would be overseen by a deputy mayor, but would include the commissioners of some 20-some departments, all the housing departments, of course, HPD and the Housing Authority and so forth, but others that aren't so obvious, the Department of commerce and others. I mean, really, the issue of homelessness is about two fundamental things. It's about being able to afford the rent because you have adequate income, or because there is some subsidized housing, or a combination thereof. People have to be able to pay their bills in order to live in stable housing, and when they can do that, they don't experience homelessness. And so if all the city agencies that could have a positive impact were at the same table and had an opportunity to come up with a couple initiatives a year to work on that would move the ball to reduce homelessness, I think over time we could have a tremendous impact on the issue of homelessness in New York City and in any other jurisdiction for that matter.
I mean, that sounds like a sensible solution, but I'm also thinking as a social worker, I mean, yes, you need to have the money to be able to pay your rent, and you have to have the money, and you also have the place to be able to live in. But there are other parts to that, and I think you mentioned this a lot, is there are many people who will never be able to have a job either because of an addiction problem or mental illness, and those people are always going to need some kind of housing, and that they're going to be homeless unless they are provided for, and how they're never going to be able to get out of that system.
There is certainly a segment of people, Kathryn, as you and I know, that will need a permanent housing subsidy for the rest of their life. I don't think that applies to all or most people that experience homelessness, but it certainly does to some. And for those individuals, I think that's why we have things like public housing, and that's why we have Section 8 programs, 100% subsidy programs for a long period of time. And so I think you use those resources for those individuals.
Robert,
folks can work, you help them go to work. Folks that can't, for whatever reason, let's move them toward those permanent subsidies and then provide them the social service support that they'll need to be able to live independently successfully.
Robert, do you know the demographics? What are the demographics of the homeless? I mean, in terms of, are they families? Are they people with disabilities, mental illness? Are they single people? I mean, do we have those kinds of statistics?
We do, and I don't have them all off the top of my head, but I can tell you that the trend since the downturn a few years ago has been to have more and more individuals that are working at wages that don't allow them to pay their bills or pay the rent in the shelter system. And so helping those individuals has become more and more of a focus of the shelter system over the last few years. That doesn't change the fact that there is some percentage, I would guess 20, 30% maybe, of folks that need a permanent subsidy, housing subsidy, along with some social service support in order to be successful. The other thing I will tell you is that since the economic downturn, I think there's been a significant increase on the number of female-headed households that have been subjected to domestic violence that are in the shelter system, and we really need to figure out ways, I think, to expand our domestic violence resources in the city as well.
How can the general public help? I always notice, and Christmas time and Thanksgiving, and everybody wants to go to the soup kitchens and help out, and there's always plenty of food and plenty of help, and sometimes even more than that. I know even here in Albany, even more, there'll be something in the paper saying we have enough help and we have enough food, but that's just 1 or 2 times a year. So how do you carry that through? You don't have to be necessarily a social worker or a professional, but can't you just be somebody, what can the average person do to contribute, let's say in New York City, to the homeless?
Well, I think the average person has to figure out what their comfort level is. I mean, something as simple as going into a shelter and arranging to be able to read books to children on a periodic basis can be very powerful. But I think we have a unique opportunity heading into this election cycle, and given the scope and the focus on homelessness in New York City, to send an email, to send a letter, to attend a public event where there are mayoral candidates present and say, you know what, this issue of homelessness is important to us, and we recognize that the approach of focusing on one agency is not enough. We really need the next mayor to focus as an administration priority across agencies on this issue and really push that forward. I think that from a public policy perspective, that would be the most powerful thing people could do over the next few months as we get into this election cycle.
Do I hear you saying that perhaps you think the present administration has kind of put the homeless situation on a back burner? And
no, I don't think so. Michael Bloomberg's efforts were very significant in many ways. The focus was very significant in many ways. I think there are always lessons learned, and I think the real lesson learned here is that it cannot be a single department focus. It really needs to be a whole administration focus, and that's the opportunity for the next mayor to pick up on the lessons learned by the previous mayor. And so I think that is actually good news, is if we can get the next mayor focused on benefiting from the lessons learned by the previous administration, then we can make a significant difference in this issue.
Can we talk about housing, specifically the housing itself? Because as I understand it, and I think you've said that and I never realized this, but there are some buildings, for instance, huge buildings where you only have a few people in the building and they're underutilized because there isn't enough monies to be put into the buildings that are falling apart or just need maintenance, and then so there's not enough money for that. So you have the structure, but you don't but they're not filled because they're not adequate housing.
Yeah, I think as you look at the New York Housing Authority, they really have been saddled with some pretty significant issues. They're significantly underfunded by HUD, and that really has come with the dismantling of public housing and HUD in this country since the early 80s, I think, to a point now where, given their resources, and they're the largest housing authority in the country, they house about 500,000 individuals in any given night. They're somewhere between $100 and $200 million a year in terms of underfunding. As a result of that, there is, as you correctly point out, a huge repair backlog. There's some buildings with serious security issues. But in addition to that, the way it's been managed over time, there are thousands of units in the New York City Housing Authority portfolio, as I understand it, that are large units, say 3-bedroom units, that are now occupied by 1 or 2 residents. And so that underutilization seems to me to be a real opportunity, and it's typically situations where the current residents are now senior citizens, the family members have moved on, and there's vacant bedrooms. It seems to me that those individuals might be better served in state-of-the-art senior housing facilities, freeing up those units for new families. Yeah. And so the question becomes, how do you do that? And I think, one of the ways we might be able to do that is to take some of the parking lots and other land that are in the portfolio of the Housing Authority, selling them or leasing them on long-term lease deals for market rate housing, and taking that money to fill the funding gap, but also between that HUD funding, building some new senior housing, providing a priority for those living in those underutilized units to move on and freeing them up for new families. I think by doing that, we could create probably another 1,000 units a year for people that may experience homelessness.
Well, that's a creative solution. Do you want to get some water?
Yeah, I will. Thank you.
Because we've been coughing here, too. But for those of you who are just joining us, Robert Hess we're talking to, and he is the chairman and CEO of Housing Solutions USA, and we're talking about the future of homelessness, particularly in New York City. Robert, what about private monies and developers? Is there any place for them in terms of helping to provide the subsidized housing?
I think there is. And there are ways to do that with tax incentives and other things. And so I think you need it all is part of a plan, a master plan that needs to be creative to create additional affordable housing, to create additional subsidized housing. And I don't want to leave out the job side, because I think there's real opportunity to create jobs on the lower end of the economic spectrum that would pay enough to be able to help support families, and we need to figure out how to move in that direction as well. So I think it's a combination of focusing on the housing availability side and affordable housing, but also creating jobs that pay enough for people to be able to pay their own bills.
Well, as I understand it, you had a job fair for the homeless.
We did, and it was kind of an idea of let's just try and let's do it right. Let's do it at the convention center. Let's get a bunch of employers there. Let's offer it to people that are living in the shelter system as a way to be able to meet their subsidy requirement under the Advantage program at the time, which was a rental subsidy to help people move out of shelter. And we had no idea who would show up. And there were, mixed feelings in the administration, whether this was a good idea or not, or whether it be more than a handful of people that would show up. But it was scheduled for 9 o'clock in the morning at the convention center. I happened to be going to work early, so I stopped by the convention center about 7:30 just to see how it was going. And there was probably 1,000 people lined up at 7:30. And throughout the day, there was over 3,000 individuals that were living in shelters, adults, that attended the jobs fair enthusiastically. And so, nobody can tell me that people don't want real opportunity, don't want a chance to go to work and be able to pay their own bills and live in stable housing, because, my experience is very, very different than that. People do want it. What they're tired of is false hope or no hope at all. But when real hope is offered, people respond generally in a very, very positive way.
Yeah, I think that's important, because I think that really is sometimes the attitude or the rap. Well, these people really don't want to work, and so, it's not our problem. And obviously this kind of a job fair kind of proves that attitude wrong. But so what actually happened? Okay, so you had 1,000 people there at 7:30 in the morning. You got about 3,000 people, and the job fair, you're saying there were employers there who had jobs that were appropriate for this group of people. What were the jobs, and what happened, and how many people got jobs? Or do you have those stats?
I don't have them all again on the top of my head, but I can tell you that there were a host of folks that had an opportunity to interview in the hospitality industry, in the food service industry, in the security industry, and in other kind of entry-level positions, many of which were hired. At the time, we had a housing subsidy as an exit strategy from shelter called the Advantage program, that individuals had to be working at least 20 hours a week in an on-the-books job in order to qualify for. And I can tell you that over 15,000 families moved out of shelter on that subsidy. And so they had jobs. They obtained jobs. They were able to keep them. They were able to exit shelter. And it was all very, very good news. I think that's the kind of creative model that we need moving forward for families with children and individuals. Let's encourage folks that can work to go to work, help them move out, subsidize their housing until their wages get to a point where they can manage on their own. I think that makes a lot of sense.
So wouldn't you have...
State basis make a lot of sense for people moving off the streets.
Well, would you have this job fair on a regular basis, once a year? I mean, make it something that's an ongoing thing, not just, a one-time deal, because it sounds like it was really successful.
I certainly would, and I would encourage future administrations to find ways to encourage people to do business with the city of New York, to actually make it a priority to offer jobs to people that find themselves sadly living in our shelter system.
Has any other city done that? I know you came from Baltimore and Philadelphia. So it had similar experiences in Philly and in Baltimore, and experiences that you've brought to New York City.
I think there's been limited efforts in places, including New York City. But I don't think it's been, again, focused on as an administration priority, and we've gotten the full benefit out of that opportunity. I mean, if you think about all the people that do business with New York City and all the money New York City spends on a whole host of products and services, you have to believe that there is tremendous opportunity there to hire folks that are clients of the city. And so it has been done on a limited basis. I think a lot more could be done.
Can we talk specifically about the children? What happens to the children in these shelters in terms of school-age children? Where do they go to school? Are they going to school? Can we talk really specific?
Sure.
Yeah.
I think in New York City there's some positive things to say there. I mean, first of all, the school system in New York has school system representatives in most, if not all, of the family with children shelters to help assess where a child is academically and get them placed properly in the proper grade. The mom has or dad has an opportunity to make a decision under federal law whether the child would stay in the school of the home of record. In other words, school where the child was going when they became homeless. They have a right to do that, to be less disruptive, or they have a right to enter a school near the shelter. And so that's a decision that's made, and then the school system representative assists in getting them get the child properly placed in the appropriate school. Beyond that, their performance is monitored by and attendance is monitored by the shelter and by the school system representatives at the shelter and in the school. And so a lot is done in New York City to make that an easy transition. It is not an easy transition. It's still disruptive to the child. Living in a shelter is disruptive to the child, and I suspect has a negative impact on their ability to learn. And so I think they do tend to fall a little bit behind. That said, there are great opportunities there, too. A few years ago, St. John's University was willing to start St. John's Academy for individuals that were in the shelter system to get AA degrees in some cases. And it was a relatively modest pilot, but St. John's deserves a lot of credit for doing it. I think 50 or 60 individuals ended up with degrees and with jobs that paid $30,000 or $35,000 a year. So I think that's a real success. Excuse me, and a real indication of the capability of folks that are in the shelter system.
I'm also thinking of some of these kids, besides, their academic, what they're able to do academically, but psychologically, are those issues addressed? Because if you're a kid and you're living in a homeless shelter, I mean, the shame and the low feelings of self-esteem and all that stuff has to come into play and I would think, have to be dealt with a social worker or a counselor.
Absolutely.
Especially,
and that's one of the reasons why at Housing Solutions USA we believe that our first rule is everyone has to be treated with dignity and respect.
Robert, how did you get into this? I'm always curious about how people get involved in whatever profession they're doing, and like, where did you start? How did you get to Housing Solutions USA?
Well, many years ago in Baltimore, I was running some business operations with disabled American veterans, and the chairman of the board asked me to look at the issue of homeless veterans in Baltimore City, which at the time, frankly, I really wasn't all that interested in doing. I'm a veteran myself, but I really didn't understand the issue of homelessness or didn't understand why veterans would end up on the streets. But we took a close look at that, and were really surprised by the lack of best practices, the lack of quality programming for veterans at the time. This is in the early 90s. And we ultimately created the Veterans Center for Maryland Homeless Veterans in Baltimore was the first name. And that program really was remarkably successful. Veterans came in off the streets. They left clean and sober 12 or 13 months later. They were leaving with living wage jobs, and they were able to support themselves and did very well thereafter. And it was that experience that caused me, as my wife would say, to make the dumbest economic decision of my life and leave the Disabled American Veterans to take over a statewide advocacy group called Action for the Homeless. I think there were 8 of us. And we tried to change our part of the world with respect to how people were thinking about dealing with, as a public policy matter, the issue of homelessness in Maryland. And that led to moving on to be the homeless czar in Philadelphia and ultimately the Commissioner of Homeless Services in New York.
So that was your career path?
It turned out to be, yes. And it's been a very rewarding one in many, many ways.
Yeah. I always, and you do see, I see veterans, or they'll have, placards or signs that say I was a Vietnam vet or a vet from one of the more recent wars out on the street, homeless. And it seems like it is such a travesty and a tragedy.
Well, it really is unacceptable on every level to ask men and women to serve our country and risk their lives and then have them return and end up on our streets. Is just unconscionable.
So where do we go from here? We have a couple minutes left. I mean, I think we've covered most of the bases, but have we left anything else that you want to say or have our listeners?
Look, I think like in an awful lot of fields, you have to learn over time. You have to make some mistakes. You try a lot of different things. Some work, some don't work. But I think there's enough data. There's enough ability now to say that certain things work and certain things don't. Safe havens for long-term street stayers works. No question about it. I think bringing a whole government together focused on how to reduce homelessness can be very effective, and I hope the next mayor will do that. I think we certainly are clear that there's a variety of housing models and housing subsidies that can work. I think we've got to get better on the job side. But all of this is very encouraging to me. We've suffered through 30 years, I think, of bad public policy from the federal level on down, and the pendulum does swing. And I'd like to believe that it's now swinging in the right direction, that we'll begin to get our hands around this very difficult but not intractable issue in a very positive way and make a difference in the lives of thousands in our city and indeed hundreds of thousands across our country that are sadly experiencing homelessness at the moment.
Well, it sounds like you obviously are doing that, but I think one thing, you just said it, homelessness is unacceptable. I mean, you have to start with that premise. It's just unacceptable. I think if you start with, yeah.
I think that's absolutely right. It is unacceptable. And in some ways, I think the public's been a little bit fatigued by this issue, not knowing what to do, not seeing real progress. But I think as we begin to turn it around and begin to show progress, that people will not only support it, they'll rally towards us and help us achieve the goal of reducing homelessness.
Well, it's been great having you on this show today and sharing all the information you have. And we've been talking to Housing Solutions USA Chairman and CEO Robert Hess, the Future of Homelessness. Thanks so much for being here.
Kathryn, thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, great talking to you. We have a couple more minutes left. Noah, you can... What have you been doing?
I've been listening and checking my email and such.
Noah is a multitasker.
I am.
Yeah.
I like doing things like that.
I'm a multitasker, and I get myself into trouble. I think Robert was really good because he pointed out some very specific kinds of things, and I always feel guilty when I'm in New York and I'm walking on the streets and I see somebody who's homeless. I feel like I should be doing something, but you do get inured, is that the word, or kind of immune to it, and you just walk by, and that's horrible to do that. And I'm on my way to some restaurant and to eat and drink, and there's a person sitting there who needs food and shelter. There's something really wrong with that. Yeah,
there is.
Yeah, so I think, but he did very clearly point out, I think, a lot of the issues.
Yeah, I mean, that's at the top of the list. Honestly, there's so many things worth getting involved with, but I think homelessness is definitely closer to the top of my list.
Well, social workers, that's one of our areas of expertise, or it should be. I forgot to ask him how many social workers they have employed under, in the office or the homeless, in that
Department of Housing?
Exactly, in the Department of Housing. I mean, that's tough work. And then some people, don't stay there that long because they can only handle it for a year or two. But still, he has he created 500 community-based safe havens.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's really great.
Yeah, he's a vet. I assume from the Vietnam War I made that assumption. I don't know.
I think it's great when people are out there trying to do things like this. It puts it in perspective, compared to people who are just like, I made $1 million, I'm a billionaire, it's like, that's cool, and like, you did something, but did you do anything for anybody else?
I wonder if you could do more on the net. It's really more and more, you talk about being millionaires and billionaires. All these young entrepreneurs are making tons of money just by creating businesses on the internet.
Yeah. Yeah.
You take these social service issues and somehow put them up on the net and do something in terms of raising money and funds and getting help. And there must be some kind of a creative entrepreneur who could do that.
Yeah, for sure. Mm-hmm. There's endless possibilities with the internet. It's really how people are gonna, A, make their money these days, and B, start movements.
Do you ever kickstart? Do you ever give monies to Kickstart or look at some of the businesses that they're starting?
Our GM Jason, he is friends with a band from his hometown, and this band is really good. They're a bunch of kids that are our age, and they wanted to press a record on vinyl, and they really didn't have any money to do it because they don't sell records. They just give them out for free on their website, just downloads. And I donated to their Kickstarter because I thought that was really cool, and they should have the opportunity to do it, and they got the amount of money they needed, and they're set to press in June.
I think that is so cool, that whole Kickstart thing. Like you can find whatever you're interested in. There's so many different projects or entrepreneurial businesses that people are trying to start, just like you described, and they just don't have the money to do that. And they don't even need that much money. Some, like say $1,000.
Yeah, they wanted like $2,000 or something like that. That's really nothing for a lot of people out there.
Yeah, Kickstart. So I have to go online and look at. A friend of mine just did that, and she contributed monies to some, to me, obscure project, but something that she was really interested in. And I thought, well, I got to do that and go and look and see, what I'm interested in and make and donate. I think that is so cool. So anyway, this band, I hope they take off. Are they good?
Yeah, I think they're awesome. I really do. I think they're great. I've never been this into a band of people who are like, kids my age, of people that I knew, and I think, they're, I don't know if they want to like per se take off. I don't know if they want to like spend their lives on the road or anything like that, but I think, to gain some more attraction would be really great for them.
Well, I'll tell you something. One of my sons was in a band and did it in college and toured the country, and they were a major college band and did stuff in Europe and did that for 6 years. And I think you kind of touched on it. It's not just playing the music, and they sold their music. They had a reputation, but you also learn a lot of other skills. You learn business skills. You have to negotiate playing in these venues. You have to drive a van across the country and all the stuff that happens. So, there's just so much you learn from that whole experience that you don't even anticipate, or living, in a situation trying to get along with the other band members. And that's a whole, other community living thing. So, there's just so much stuff that happens because people think, oh, you're in a band, but, and don't, how much money do you make? But they don't realize all the other kind of things that you are participating in and learning in the whole process. And I know he did a lot.
Right. Yeah. I think, like you were saying before, with the internet, this, that's where it's got to go now. I think just to get the word out about something, that is clearly the best place to go. I mean, otherwise, how are you going to do it? You can just play a couple shows, yeah, but you have to put yourself up there, give yourself a fair chance.
Exactly. Well, we have to say goodbye, and I hope you enjoyed this show. You've been listening to the Social Workers Radio Talk Show with Kathryn Zox, your social worker with a microphone, and Noah Bondi on the board. Hope you had a good morning with us. Have a great week, and we'll see you next Thursday.
You're listening to The Social Workers on WCDB Albany.